In the waning months of World War II, as Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany from every direction, a secret project existed in the mountains of Lower Silesia that would later become one of history's most controversial mysteries. An invention so classified, so guarded, that those who worked on it were bound by silence. And those who captured it would spend decades debating whether it was real or merely the desperate fantasy of a defeated regime. Picture this. Deep within a mountain facility, scientists and engineers worked around the clock on something they called Die Glocke, the bell, a machine whose very existence challenges everything we thought we knew about Nazi technological ambition and the origins of modern physics. Some claim it was an anti-gravity device. Others insist it was a weapons prototype that could reshape the landscape itself. And still, others say it was nothing more than an elaborate hoax, a myth constructed from the desperate testimonies of traumatized prisoners and the fevered imaginations of Cold War theorists. What makes Die Glocke so fascinating is not what it actually was, but rather what its story reveals about how history gets written, how evidence vanishes, how eyewitness testimony becomes legend, and how a single mysterious object, if it ever existed at all, can haunt the historical record for generations, becoming more powerful in its absence than it ever could have been in its presence. The truth about Die Glocke lies somewhere in the space between confirmed fact and elaborate fiction, between the physical evidence that some claim to have seen and the absolute silence maintained by those who might have known the truth. To understand this mystery, we must first travel back to a time when the world was very different, when science and ideology became dangerously intertwined, and when the boundary between visionary thinking and pseudoscience became almost impossible to distinguish. A time when Nazi Germany was desperately searching for wonder weapons, desperately seeking technological solutions to military problems that had become increasingly insurmountable, desperately grasping at any possibility that might reverse the tide of a war that was clearly being lost on every front. The story of Die Glocke cannot be separated from the story of Nazi Germany's scientific ambitions during the final years of World War II. By 1944, the German war machine was in freefall. The Allies had invaded Normandy. The Soviets were advancing relentlessly from the east, and the industrial heartland of the Third Reich lay in ruins from constant bombing campaigns. In this context of existential crisis, the Nazi regime invested enormous resources into what they called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, last-ditch technological solutions that Hitler and his inner circle genuinely believed could save the Reich from annihilation. Some of these weapons were real. The V-2 rocket, for instance, was a genuine technological achievement that would later become the foundation of both American and Soviet ballistic missile programs. Others, like the planned atomic bomb program, were real efforts that failed to bear fruit before the war ended. But Die Glocke exists in a murkier category. It may have been real. It may have been a concept that never advanced beyond the planning stages, or it may have been nothing more than the product of misunderstandings, mistranslations, and the desperation of people trying to make sense of chaotic wartime conditions. The first whispers of Die Glocke emerged in the testimonies of Polish and Soviet prisoners who claimed to have seen something extraordinary being constructed at a facility called Der Riese, the giant which was located in the WWII Mountains in what is now Lower Silesia, on the border between what would become Poland and East Germany. These prisoners spoke of a bell-shaped structure made of an unknown metal alloy, said to be bell-shaped or egg-shaped, which produced strange effects when activated, electrical discharges, anti-gravity phenomena, and devastating destructive forces. They described working in conditions of extreme hardship under the watch of SS guards, moving materials and machinery for a project whose ultimate purpose was kept from them, knowing only that they were part of something important, something dangerous, something that their captors feared might be captured by the enemy. What emerges from the primary documentary evidence we have access to is a picture of intense scientific activity at WWII during the last year of the war, of a facility that was indeed kept under extraordinary security, of projects that were classified at the highest levels of the Nazi regime. What we cannot easily determine is exactly what those projects involved. The problem, fundamentally, is that the people who would have known the most about Die Glocke, the scientists and engineers who actually worked on it, the Nazi officials who authorized its funding, the SS officers who guarded it, were either killed during the war, fled in its aftermath, or were captured and interrogated by the Allies. But those interrogations produced contradictory and often unreliable testimony. Some of those who claimed knowledge of Die Glocke may have been attempting to provide valuable information to their captors in hopes of clemency. Others may have been traumatized to the point of unreliability, and still others may have been deliberately spreading disinformation, either on behalf of intelligence agencies or for their own purposes. One of the most important pieces of evidence in the Die Glocke story is the testimony of Jakob Sporenberg, an SS officer who claimed to have witnessed the evacuation of secret Nazi weapons from Lower Silesia in January 1945. According to Sporenberg, he saw soldiers moving a bell-shaped object, heavily shielded and surrounded by an unusual electrical field, out of the mountain facility as Soviet forces approached. He claimed that the device was loaded aboard an aircraft and flown away, suggesting that the Nazis managed to remove it before it could be captured. This testimony, if accurate, would explain why no physical evidence of Die Glocke has ever been found. It would mean that the device successfully escaped the final collapse of Nazi Germany. However, Sporenberg's account has been questioned by historians, who note that his memory may have been unreliable, that he may have been confused about what he actually saw, or that he may have been constructing a narrative designed to impress or gain favor with his interrogators. Other testimonies emerged from Polish prisoners who worked at Der Riese, describing a device that could create a terrifying effect, perhaps an electromagnetic pulse, perhaps something related to radiation or energy manipulation, that left surrounding vegetation wilted and animals dead. These descriptions have led some researchers to theorize that Die Glocke might have been an early experiment with directed energy weapons, perhaps a prototype nuclear device, or possibly a machine designed to test the effects of high-energy physics in ways Nazis believed could be weaponized. The problem with these testimonies is that they come from people under extraordinary stress, people who may have been coerced, people who had every reason to be dishonest or confused, and people whose accounts were filtered through interpreters and recorded by officials who had their own agendas regarding how the information would be used and understood. Moreover, the Nazi regime itself was prone to grandiose claims about its technological capabilities. Hitler was notoriously prone to believing in the possibility of wonder weapons and to authorizing massive investments in projects that had little likelihood of success, but which appealed to his imagination and his desperate hope that something, anything, might reverse Germany's military fortunes. It is entirely possible that Die Glocke, even if it existed, was a much less impressive and capable device than the stories that grew up around it, and that it failed to produce the results that its developers hoped for. The problem of evidence becomes even more complicated when we consider what happened immediately after the war. The United States conducted Operation Paperclip, a program designed to recruit German scientists and engineers before the Soviets could do so, and to bring their expertise and their research to America. Hundreds of German scientists were brought to the United States, including some who may have worked on secret Nazi weapons programs, and they were given new identities, protection, and resources to continue their research. It is entirely possible that a scientist or engineer who had knowledge of Die Glocke's actual nature was brought to America through this program, and that whatever information they possessed was immediately classified and has remained hidden from public view ever since. Similarly, The Soviet Union captured vast amounts of German equipment and documents, and it is entirely plausible that the Soviets may have found evidence of Die Glocke, or may have believed they found such evidence, and kept it secret as part of their own weapons development programs. This scenario, where Die Glocke becomes a secret shared between Cold War superpowers, too dangerous or too embarrassing to be revealed, is entirely consistent with what we know about how both the American and Soviet governments conducted their scientific programs during the Cold War. The historical context of physics research in Nazi Germany is crucial to understanding why the Die Glocke mystery has captured people's imaginations so powerfully. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, physics had become a discipline of almost magical significance, a field where it seemed that entirely new forces and phenomena might be discovered at any moment. Nuclear physics, in particular, seemed to open the door to unlimited possibilities, and the Nazi regime, despite eventually driving most of its best physicists into exile, continued to pursue research into both nuclear weapons and theoretical physics. Moreover, the Nazis were fascinated by speculative ideas that fell outside mainstream scientific thinking. They were interested in alternative theories of physics, in research areas that orthodox scientists might dismiss as pseudoscience, and in any possibility, no matter how far-fetched, that might provide a technological advantage. This combination of legitimate scientific ambition and willingness to pursue fringe theories created an environment where something like Die Glocke, if it existed, could plausibly have been developed in secret. The Bell's specific legend involves claims that it operated based on principles of anti-gravity or electromagnetic manipulation, that it produced strange biological effects in its vicinity, and that it was capable of affecting the space-time continuum itself. Claims that, taken together, suggest that whoever designed Die Glocke, if it existed, was attempting to weaponize theoretical physics in ways that seem almost impossible from the perspective of modern science. Yet it is precisely this impossibility that makes Die Glocke so compelling as a story, because it exists in the space where history and science fiction blur together, where the actual evidence is fragmentary enough that almost any interpretation seems plausible. After the war ended, Die Glocke became a subject of intense interest within scientific and intelligence communities. Information about it began to circulate in declassified documents, in interviews with scientists, and in the accounts of those who claimed to have worked on it or to have learned about it from others who had. Gradually, the legend grew, accumulating details and becoming more elaborate with each retelling. By the 1960s and 1970s, Die Glocke had become a staple of alternative history literature and conspiracy theory, a subject that fascinated researchers who were interested in hidden histories of technology and suppressed scientific knowledge. One particularly influential account came from Igor Witkowski, a Polish journalist who in the 1990s published a book claiming to have uncovered evidence that Die Glocke was a real anti-gravity device that the Nazis had indeed developed and that had either been hidden by the Allies or had been successfully evacuated by the Nazis themselves. Witkowski's account, based on interviews and what he claimed was newly discovered documentation, presented Die Glocke not as a vague legend, but as a concrete technological achievement, something that should be taken seriously as a genuine piece of history rather than dismissed as wartime rumor. His work gave new energy to the Die Glocke legend and inspired further investigation into what had become a genuinely mysterious historical question. However, Witkowski's work has been controversial among academic historians and physicists, many of whom argue that his interpretations are speculative, that his sources are unreliable, and that he has constructed a narrative that goes far beyond what the evidence actually supports. The tension between Witkowski's more credulous approach and the skepticism of mainstream historians reflects a broader divide in how people approach historical mysteries. On one side are those who believe that enormous amounts of history have been deliberately hidden from public view, that evidence has been suppressed, and that careful investigation of fragmentary sources can reveal truths that official narratives deny. On the other side are those who believe that applying rigorous historical methodology and demanding reliable evidence is the only way to separate fact from fiction, and who worry that acceptance of speculative accounts damages our ability to understand what actually happened. The most dramatic claim about Die Glocke involves its supposed final fate and its potential impact on the outcome of World War II. According to various accounts, the device was either successfully evacuated from Der Riese before it was captured by Soviet forces, or it was left behind but was subsequently recovered by the Soviets or the Allies and hidden away as a classified secret. If the device was successfully evacuated, it supposedly made its way to Argentina, or possibly to the United States through Operation Paperclip, or to some other location where it could be kept secret and studied. Some accounts claim that Die Glocke was actually tested in 1945 in a remote location, perhaps in the Arctic or in an isolated part of Eastern Europe, and that the test produced catastrophic results, perhaps a dimensional rupture or an explosion of unprecedented magnitude. These accounts inevitably lack direct evidence, but they persist because they fill in gaps in the historical record and provide dramatic explanations for otherwise mysterious events. The problem with these accounts is that they tend to become increasingly elaborate as they are retold, gathering details and acquiring an aura of authority without the underlying evidence becoming any more solid. The core question remains: did Die Glocke actually exist? And if so, what was it actually designed to do? The answer, from the perspective of mainstream historical and scientific scholarship, is we don't know, and we probably never will know unless previously classified documents are released or an enormous cache of evidence is discovered. This unsatisfying answer is precisely why the mystery has persisted so successfully. It leaves room for speculation, for creative interpretation, for the possibility that something truly remarkable and revolutionary actually occurred, but was then hidden away and forgotten. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Die Glocke story is how it intersects with the history of modern physics and with the development of various speculative scientific theories. Some researchers have speculated that Die Glocke might have been an attempt to create a device based on principles of anti-gravity, or of what is sometimes called electrogravitics, a field of research that has always existed on the margins of mainstream physics, but which has attracted genuine scientific interest at various points in history. The possibility that the Nazis were experimenting with such technologies connects to broader questions about what forms of physics research might have been pursued in secret during and after the war, and whether information about such research might have been deliberately suppressed by governments that saw it as too dangerous or too destabilizing to allow into the public domain. Similarly, some accounts of Die Glocke mention its supposed effects on time and space, which has led some speculative researchers to wonder whether the device might have been based on an early understanding of relativity theory or of what modern physics calls space-time manipulation. The truth is almost certainly far more mundane. If Die Glocke existed at all, it was probably some kind of high-energy physics experiment or weapons prototype that produced impressive effects, but which did not actually violate the laws of physics or create genuine technological breakthroughs of the kind that legend suggests. Yet the fact that the Nazis were pursuing this kind of research, if they were, is itself historically significant, because it demonstrates how far they were willing to reach in their desperation to find a solution to their military crisis. The question of what happened to Die Glocke after the war is perhaps the most important unsolved part of the mystery. If the device existed and was successfully hidden or evacuated, then it becomes a matter of historical importance to determine where it went and what became of it. Various possibilities have been proposed, It was captured by the Americans and is being held in a classified facility, possibly Area 51, or some other secret weapons testing ground. It was captured by the Soviets and incorporated into their own research programs. It was destroyed by the Nazis themselves to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Or it was left behind at Der Riese and is still buried somewhere in the mountains of Lower Silesia, waiting to be discovered. Expeditions have been conducted to the Der Riese facility to search for evidence of Die Glocke, and while they have uncovered evidence of extensive underground construction and secret military activity, they have not found any clear physical evidence of the legendary device itself. This absence of physical evidence is sometimes cited as proof that Die Glocke never existed, but it could equally be cited as evidence that it was successfully hidden or removed. The lack of evidence does not definitively prove either position. The mystery of what happened to Die Glocke thus becomes a kind of historical Rorschach test, where different people read different meanings into the same absence of evidence, and where the mystery itself becomes more important and more culturally significant than any concrete answer could ever be. The Die Glocke story also touches on larger questions about the reliability of historical testimony and the nature of historical truth itself. We live in an era where historians have become increasingly sophisticated about acknowledging the limitations of their knowledge, about recognizing that much of what we claim to know about the past is based on fragmentary evidence and educated guesses, and about understanding that the official narratives we are taught often conceal as much as they reveal. In this context, the Die Glocke mystery becomes emblematic of a broader historical condition. There are enormous gaps in our knowledge of what happened during World War II and in its immediate aftermath, and those gaps are large enough that they have been filled with all manner of speculation, conspiracy theory, and creative interpretation. Some of this creative interpretation is undoubtedly nonsense, the product of excessive imagination or deliberate hoaxing, but some of it may contain kernels of truth, and there is no reliable way to definitively separate the two categories without access to information that may no longer exist or that may be deliberately hidden from public view. The Die Glocke mystery, in this sense, is a perfect historical riddle. It cannot be solved because the evidence is insufficient, but it can also never be dismissed, because the possibility that it has real historical substance cannot be entirely eliminated. This makes it an ideal subject for documentary treatment, because it allows exploration not only of what may have happened, but also of how we as a society deal with historical mysteries, how we construct narratives about the past, and how we decide what to believe and what to dismiss. The cultural impact of Die Glocke has been substantial, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that its actual historical existence and purpose remain unclear. The device has become a fixture in popular culture, appearing in science fiction novels, in conspiracy theory communities, in alternative history thought experiments, and in documentaries, podcasts, and online forums devoted to hidden history and suppressed knowledge. The legend has evolved to include supposed sightings and encounters, testimonies from people claiming to have worked on the project or to have knowledge of it, and elaborate theories about how Die Glocke technology might have influenced post-war scientific development. Some people have even claimed that modern anti-gravity technology, or even the technology behind unidentified flying objects, might be derived from or connected to Die Glocke research. These elaborations of the myth should be treated with considerable skepticism, as they venture well beyond what the historical evidence supports and enter the realm of pure speculation. Yet the persistence of the Die Glocke legend, its continued ability to capture people's imaginations decades after the war ended, is itself a historically significant phenomenon. It reveals something about how we as a society relate to the past, about our desire to believe that there are hidden histories waiting to be discovered, and about our suspicion that powerful institutions may be deliberately concealing important knowledge. From public view, in the Internet age, where information travels rapidly, and where alternative narratives can find audiences without needing approval from mainstream institutions. The Die Glocke legend has gained even greater prominence and has become a central reference point in discussions of hidden Nazi technology and suppressed historical truths. The methodological question of how to approach Die Glocke as historians and researchers is crucial. One approach is the skeptical approach, which demands rigorous evidence, which treats extraordinary claims with appropriate skepticism, and which is reluctant to affirm the existence of something as important and remarkable as Die Glocke without clear and reliable evidence. This approach has the advantage of maintaining historical rigor and preventing us from being misled by hoaxes and false claims. But it has the disadvantage of potentially dismissing genuine mysteries and of making us too confident in our belief that we understand what happened in the past. The other approach is the speculative approach, which is willing to consider possibilities that go beyond the confirmed evidence, which sees gaps in the historical record as invitations for investigation, rather than signs that something did not happen, and which maintains openness to revelations and reinterpretations of existing evidence. This approach has the advantage of keeping historical inquiry open and dynamic, but it has the disadvantage of potentially encouraging people to believe in things for which there is insufficient evidence, and of blurring the line between history and fantasy. The truth, almost certainly, lies somewhere in the middle. We should be both skeptical and open-minded. We should demand good evidence, while acknowledging that some genuine historical events may leave very fragmentary traces, and we should be honest about what we know and what we do not know. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Der Riese was indeed a real Nazi facility, that it was indeed engaged in secret weapons research, that prisoners did work there under terrible conditions, and that the Nazis were indeed desperate enough in the final months of the war to pursue any possibility, no matter how speculative, that might provide a technological advantage. What we cannot say with confidence is that Die Glocke specifically existed, what it actually was, if it did exist, whether it functioned as claimed, where it ended up, or what role it might have played in Nazi weapons development or in the post-war scientific landscape. These are the real historical questions that remain open, and they are questions that are unlikely to be definitively answered without access to evidence that may no longer be available. The Die Glocke mystery thus remains one of World War II's most tantalizing unsolved puzzles, a story that blends verified historical facts with speculation, testimony, and legend in ways that make it almost impossible to determine where truth ends and fiction begins. Its enduring appeal lies in this very ambiguity, in its ability to spark our curiosity about hidden histories and suppressed knowledge, and in its suggestion that even after nearly 80 years, major historical secrets may still exist, waiting to be discovered, waiting to change our understanding of the past. As we conclude our exploration of Die Glocke, we are left with more questions than answers, which is perhaps the most honest conclusion we can reach. Did the bell actually exist? Was it a functioning anti-gravity device, an electromagnetic weapon, or something else entirely? Did it remain on Earth, hidden somewhere in classified government facilities, or did it end up in some other location? Will we ever know the truth, or will Die Glocke remain a permanent mystery, a historical phantom that haunts the records of World War II and the early Cold War? These questions, ultimately, may be less important than what they reveal about how we construct historical narratives and how we deal with uncertainty and ambiguity in our understanding of the past. The Die Glocke mystery reminds us that history is not a finished story with all the pieces in place, but rather an ongoing conversation with the past, a process of interpretation and reinterpretation based on the evidence we have access to, and our willingness to engage honestly with gaps in our knowledge. It reminds us that some of the most important events and developments in history may occur in secret, may be deliberately hidden from public view, and may remain unknown or disputed for decades or even centuries. It reminds us that we should approach historical claims with a combination of skepticism and openness, demanding good evidence, while acknowledging that the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. And it reminds us that the search for historical truth is never complete, that mysteries remain, and that there may always be secrets of the past waiting to be discovered by future generations with access to information and perspectives that we do not currently possess. The bell, whether it was real or imagined, whether it was a triumph of Nazi engineering or a desperate hallucination of a dying regime, lives on in the historical record and in the collective imagination, a testament to the power of a good mystery to endure and to fascinate long after the events themselves have receded into history. Whether Die Glocke will ever be definitively solved remains to be seen, but what seems certain is that as long as people are interested in the history of World War II, in the development of advanced weapons technologies, and in the mysteries of the past, Die Glocke will continue to capture their imagination and to inspire new investigations, new theories, and new debates about what it really was and what role it played in one of the most consequential and mysterious periods of human history. The legacy of Die Glocke extends beyond mere historical curiosity, touching on fundamental questions about scientific progress, military innovation, and the nature of technological advancement itself. Throughout history, breakthrough discoveries and innovations have often been made in secret, have been guarded jealously by the nations that developed them, and have remained unknown to the public for years or decades. The Manhattan Project, the development of radar technology, the creation of jet aircraft engines, the invention of early computers, all of these emerged from classified research programs and remained hidden from public view until well after the war. In this context, the possibility that Die Glocke might have been something remarkable and revolutionary should not be dismissed out of hand simply because evidence is scarce. At the same time, we must be careful not to slip into the trap of believing that every mysterious gap in the historical record represents evidence of a hidden truth. The burden of proof must remain on those making the extraordinary claims, and we should not accept speculative accounts simply because they fill in gaps in our knowledge or satisfy our curiosity about what might have been. The Die Glocke mystery thus becomes a case study in how we decide what to believe about history, how we evaluate evidence, and how we balance skepticism with openness to possibilities that the official record may not fully acknowledge. It is a case study that becomes increasingly relevant as we move further from the events themselves and as documents are declassified, as survivors pass away, and as the possibility of new evidence emerging becomes progressively smaller. In some ways, the Die Glocke mystery is a race against time. The longer we wait, the more people who might have known the truth pass away, the more documents are lost or destroyed, and the more the real history becomes obscured by myth, legend, and speculation. If Die Glocke is real, then we may already have reached a point where it becomes impossible to recover the truth about what it was and what became of it. If it is not real, then understanding how and why the myth developed tells us something important about how people in desperate times, both during the war and in the anxious decades that followed, were willing to believe in extraordinary possibilities and to construct elaborate narratives around fragmentary evidence and ambiguous testimony. The Die Glocke story is thus simultaneously a cautionary tale about historical methodology and a fascinating window into how we as a species construct meaning from mystery and uncertainty. It demonstrates both the strengths and the weaknesses of historical investigation, showing how historians must sometimes work with incomplete information and must make judgments about reliability and credibility without having perfect knowledge of their sources. It shows how the passage of time can transform testimony into legend, how cultural anxieties and preoccupations shape how we interpret evidence from the past, and how the same fragmentary sources can be read in radically different ways, depending on one's starting assumptions and interpretive framework. In many ways, Die Glocke is the perfect historical mystery for the modern era, an enigma that cannot be solved through traditional historical methodology alone, that requires engagement with multiple disciplines and perspectives, and that inevitably resists final interpretation and closure. It invites us to think deeply about what we know and what we don't know, about the limits of historical knowledge, and about how we can approach the past with both intellectual rigor and appropriate humility. The story of Die Glocke is ultimately not just the story of a possibly secret Nazi weapon, but rather a story about history itself, about how we investigate it, interpret it, preserve it, and pass it on to future generations. In that sense, whether Die Glocke was real or legendary, whether it changed the course of history or never existed at all, its impact on how we think about history and historical mystery is undeniable and lasting.